I had stopped last time right here where I talked about the cardiac conduction system, right? And this was all, we are using the heart and heart rate as a proxy for the autonomic nervous system, as like a probe for our autonomic nerve functioning, and how meditation or yoga can affect that is what we're going to explore. All right, so let's look at the wiring of the heart just a little bit. Whatever effect the autonomic nervous system is going to have on the heart is going to be the most pronounced at the SA node. This is sort of the first domino that falls, so to speak, in terms of the cardiac cycle. It's that spontaneous depolarization that happens at the sinoatrial node. All right. And that sinoatrial node, I showed you yesterday how there's this spontaneous leaking of current through the membrane in those cells, and eventually it reaches threshold, and there's an action potential, and it causes this cascade that leads to the contraction of the heart. Well, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system do not initiate that, right? It's a spontaneous thing, but they can affect the rate at which it happens. So for the parasympathetic nervous system, it can cause what's called bradycardia. And that's not, so that's a slowing down in the heart rate. Yes, pronounced bradycardia, not Brady. He is slowing down a little bit now too. And this is through the release of acetylcholine. That's the neurotransmitter that's used, and we'll see that acetylcholine. That's going to be a theme that you'll see. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter of slowing down the heart, as used by these parasympathetic nerves. So these parasympathetic nerves synapse on the SA node, and then release acetylcholine. The nerve itself that does this, we've already mentioned it last time, is the vagus nerve. It comes down and synapsing on the heart and affecting the rate at which the heart contracts. And we'll see how that works in the next slide. On the other hand, we have tachycardia. So tachycardia is induced by the sympathetic nervous system, and the neurotransmitter that it uses is norepinephrine, formerly called noradrenaline, but we call it norepinephrine. And tachycardia, one of the ways you can remember that, what's the little, not the speedometer on your car, but what's the name of that needle? Does anyone drive a stick shift? Anyone ever driven a stick shift? You know, when you're putting the clutch in and that needle, the like revs, the RPM. Yeah, what do they call that? Tachometer. Yeah, tachometer. So it just means how fast the motor is cycling. And that's what tachy means. So tachycardia just means a speeding heart. Speeding. All right. So here's how it works. Here is a normal heart. Well, they're all normal. Here is an unaffected heart, where we have the polarized membrane down here that's spontaneously leaking and coming up to the threshold, which is at about minus 35 millivolts. When it hits that threshold, we get an action potential, all right, which is a firing of that neuron. We're not going through the molecular details of that, because we don't really need to, but just know that when it gets to this threshold, we have an action potential, and that's that neuron firing. And then it gets up here, it starts to repolarize, and comes all the way back down to baseline. Down here, it begins spontaneously repolarize again until it reaches. So the pacing of the heartbeat, you'll notice the pacing, that frequency of the heartbeat, is dependent upon the time it takes for this depolarization to go from spontaneous to go from the baseline all the way up to the threshold. Okay, So parasympathetic nerves, they slow the heart by causing the cell to hyperpolarize. So the baseline, rather than being at minus 60, is even lower, at minus 70 or so. It hyperpolarizes. So this heart cell, this myocardiocyte, has further to go. It has further to go till it reaches that same threshold, and thus takes longer. All right. The acetylcholine is going to cause electric fields in that muscle cell that's going to hyperpolarize. Right. On the other hand, it's exactly the opposite for the sympathetic nerve. Sympathetic nerve causes the cell, when it's repolarizing, to not repolarize quite as much. All right, so the baseline, instead of being at minus 60, is at like minus 50, which is much closer to the threshold. So it takes that myocardiocyte a lot less time to reach that threshold and activate another action potential. All right, does that make sense? Yeah. So that's all the background we need to be able to talk about this concept, heart rate variability. And because we only have we have 8 EEGs, we're going to hook 8 of you up to that today. We don't have enough for everybody in the class. 4 of you are going to put on heart rate monitors today, and we're going to try to measure heart rate variability in those students. Although that, again, is not something that is completely straightforward. But we'll work through it together. All right, so what is heart rate variability? So you may think that your heart rate is just like a pendulum, nice and steady all the time, and it like varies only when you start running. That's not actually how a fully healthy individual's heart functions. There are variations in the distance of time between the heartbeats. All right. So here is an EEG. This isn't a single heart cell. This is the entire heart, right? So we have it's like the kind of thing that we've been measuring with our little chips. So it's the electric field disturbance caused by the contraction of the entire heart. And R, they have letters that are assigned to each of these bumps. R, the peak R, that's the very high peak that's associated with the contraction of the left ventricle heart. So if you just measure the R to R interval, this R to R interval, they're measured in milliseconds, you can convert that to beats per minute, right? So you just take 60 seconds, divide it by 0.845 seconds, or 845 milliseconds, and you'll get 71 beats per minute. All right. So each of these heartbeats, they have slightly different BPM there, don't they? The heart rate is varying a little bit. That is due to the effects of the autonomic nervous system. So exhalation, particularly intentional exhalation, is driven by the parasympathetic nervous system. So, and we know that the vagus nerve is controlling the diaphragm. It's helping us to breathe. It's also controlling the rate of the heart. So when we're getting parasympathetic efflux through the vagus, it's affecting our ability to breathe, but also affecting the heart rate. So when you have this lengthening or slowing of the heart rate, it's like very small slowing of the heart rate, that can be attributed to a spike in parasympathetic activity in the body. Likewise, when the heart is shorter, these shorter regions of heartbeat, that can correspond to inhalation. That is that is attributable to the sympathetic nervous system. Now, not every time you breathe in or breathe out is your heart slowing or speeding up, or at least in every person. It's not quite like that. All right, and this is what we're going to talk about. Everybody has a different profile in terms of their heart rate variability. So heart rate variability can be depicted in a single number, all right, across. So say you took a rhythmogram or a series of heartbeat, like an EKG, right, an ECG. You could take those time intervals between the RR intervals for every beat and look at the standard deviation of those intervals. You guys know what standard deviation is at this point. All right, we've talked about that in lab. And that standard deviation is a measure of heart rate variability. The larger the standard deviation, the larger the heart rate variability in your heart. So if you have a high heart rate variability, that in general indicates a fairly healthy autonomic nervous system balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic. It's going to indicate breathing patterns that are deeper and longer. And they have shown there's a huge number. I could spend the rest of the class just going through the literature on this, but there's a lot of data to show that people with a high heart rate variabilities, these people have an increased resistance to stress. They are people whose personality tends to have a more positive emotional tenor to it, so less sort of negativity or other emotional distress. People with low heart rate variability, that indicates an overactive sympathetic nervous system, all right, the fight or flight, the adrenaline-driven nervous system. Their heart rate is fairly uniform because the parasympathetic nervous system is not able to cut through the hyperactive sympathetic nervous system. And this is often correlated with shallow, rapid breathing. It is a predictor of, it's comorbid with heart disease, cancer, those kinds of things. A predictor of various indices of mortality. And it's also a predictor of anxiety, depression, PTSD. People with these sorts of problems tend to have a lower HRV. Yeah.
Is heart rate variability depend on what each person experiences or passed down?
There's probably going to be a little bit of both. There's going to be environmental cues or lifestyle cues that are affecting heart rate variability. Probably that's the biggest predictor. But there's certainly going to be a genetic component to it. There's probably an epigenetic component to it as well. So yeah, all those things probably have some impact. I would say that even if there is a genetic component, that the choices that you make in terms of your lifestyle, the sort of state, the life of the mind that you choose to cultivate, these sorts of things have a significant influence over this. Epigenetics means things, traits that can get passed down through generations that are not hardwired in terms of a gene that is coded for that. And is more, so there's an epigenetic correlation between the nutritional health of a father and the presence or absence of obesity in a child, for example. That's not something that's being genetically transferred, but it's an epigenetic. It's like on top of the genetics, but is heritable. Maybe not heritable is not the right word, but anyways, let's bring it back here. And here are a couple what are called rhythmograms. We'll see that in a moment. And we see here with time, this is time, and this is simply heart rate, all right? And this is the variation of heart rate. So this is not the EEG trace. This is not the EEG trace. What this is measuring is that change in heart rate with time, okay? Here is a person with high heart rate variability, all right? So the spikes between here are quite high, right? And there's other wave patterns. This is a very uniform distribution of heart rates, the heart rate below. Yeah.
So high heart from walking to running while you're sitting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, so this is not to be confused with arrhythmia, right? Which is a pathological condition where the heart is not firing properly and the timing of the heart is not correct. The heart rate variability is actually a kind of it can be a sort of a small variation. So we're talking about milliseconds here, right? Okay. So it's actually, despite what might happen in lab today, it's in general should not be that difficult to measure this. So here is some guy that built a little EEG machine out of some chip, not too, or EKG, not too different from the one that you guys have been messing with all semester. And he has it tied in to this orb, so that when there is high heart rate variability, the orb glows blue, and when there's low heart rate variability, it glows red as a biofeedback thing. So we'll have this thing on, use his breath, and try to get the orb to glow blue. All right. So it's not, and he's, I don't know, whatever. There's a lot of techie nerds out there that build all kinds of fun stuff. One of them. So these are a couple rhythmograms that he created. An rhythmogram is just time versus heart rate, BPM. And this was his heart rate, his rhythmogram, when he was surfing the web, and here he was when he was meditating. All right. So we're gonna unpack these a little bit. So to really understand what's going on, we're going to take this rhythmogram and we're going to deconvolute it, because a rhythmogram can have a number of frequencies of oscillation in terms of heart rate lying on top of one another. Just like when you listen to an audio signal, like a song, there can be multiple frequencies at the same time that you're hearing, right? And so you can deconvolute that and see what, so for example, when you look at like the EQ, or sometimes, you see the frequency range and you see them spiking going up and down, right? That's doing exactly that. It's separating out the frequencies that are happening all at the same time. So we can do that to a rhythmogram. The mathematical process is called a Fourier transform. We don't need to worry about exactly how that works, but we'll call it a spectral analysis, and it's going to separate out the different oscillations across the frequency range, and some of them will have more power and some of them will have less power. If there's no oscillation in the data at a particular frequency, then the amplitude of that wave is very small, very low power. Right? And if there's a lot of oscillation at a particular frequency, then the amplitude is much higher. All right? And that would be like the spikes going up and down on your audio signal when you're looking, And it turns out, and we've already said this, but it's another way to think about it, that when you have very low frequency oscillations, that's driven by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? So that means that your heart rate variability is not changing very rapidly, all right? It's changing extremely slowly. That's because the sympathetic nervous system is imposing its drumbeat of the speed of the heart on it. So don't be confused here. Sympathetic nervous system causes the heart to beat faster, but it also slows down the rate at which the heart rate changes. Do you follow what I mean by that? So the variability goes down. The way that speed with which the heart is beating, which is fast, changes. That acceleration, the rate of change of that heart rate goes down. So low frequency oscillations in the heart rate variability are driven by the sympathetic nervous system. Did I lose anybody there? No? Kind of? A little? All right. The heart rate, when it's being driven by the sympathetic nervous system, is going rapidly, right? It's going like this. But the rate at which this heart rate is changing, okay? So in mathematical terms, you call it the derivative. I don't want to freak anybody out with calculus here. But that rate at which this is changing is very slow.
So
The oscillation is the change in the speed. Okay, the change in the speed. So like here, it's changing. It takes a long time for the heart rate to maybe speed up when you're being driven by the sympathetic nervous system. So the change in that heart rate is slow. Whereas when you have a lot of parasympathetic input, the heart rate is shifting between slow and fast very rapidly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I know that's confusing because it's like we're flipping the two concepts there, but we're not. So very low frequency oscillations in the heart rate variability is associated with the sympathetic nervous system. High frequency oscillations are associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. All right, so let's put this stuff that I found on the web. It's amazing who's out there. Let's put his rhythmograms on there. So his web surfing, this is associated with low heart rate variability, and the meditation that he was doing was associated with high heart rate variability. So let's try to look at this data and pull out those frequencies. So here is, I drew in the oscillations as I saw them, all right? So on the top, we have these slow or low frequency oscillations in the heart rate, all right? And I put the average amplitude of these oscillations here. This is about the average amplitude, so fairly high power, okay? Here are these high frequency oscillations. Also has a fairly high amplitude of oscillation, all right? This is not to say, like this red line that I have is not exactly the trace, right, that this guy created. There are some high frequency oscillations in when he's surfing the web, but they're very low in amplitude. They're very low in amplitude. This would be like the high frequency sound in a song, quiet, whereas the bass is kicking in. Here, this would be a really hot, loud, high frequency sound in a kind of quiet bit. So there are low frequency oscillations here as well, but they're much smaller in amplitude. Does that drawing help you guys understand that? Yeah.
So is this based on like sound or
No. It's not based on sound, but it is 100% completely analogous to sound.
Oh.
So what I'm talking about in terms of signal processing here can apply to any kind of frequency distribution, right? That goes in the time domain. Yeah, you can deconvolute any signal in the same way if you want. And I'm just using sound because, like, whatever, you guys are probably the most familiar with that. Yeah.
I'm confused by what the red line.
Yeah. So, I mean, these little guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this line, it's just red so that you can know which one I'm referring to. But this line is sort of the average amplitude.
Okay.
So amplitude is how tall or short a wave is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the average amplitude of this oscillation, okay, is that. Whereas the average amplitude of the blue is this one, and likewise, it's actually inversed in this other rhythm.
And the red.
This one here? Oh,
No.
oh, here? That is, so if you look at it, it's me connecting the middle of each of these oscillations.
Okay.
All right? And it's pulling out lower frequency oscillations that are, so like this thing that's going up and down, it's not like all in a straight line. No, it's oscillating, it's going up and down like this. And so there's another oscillation on
Okay.
top of it.
Okay.
And that's a lower frequency oscillation.
That's what the.
Yeah, here, the blue is high frequency oscillations, and the red is low frequency oscillations. Does that make sense? So red is very low frequency, blue is very high frequency. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can take the power spectrum of any point in time. It's sort of like taking a snapshot of your EQ at one moment in time during a song. All right? That's the power spectrum. So the power of all the different frequencies frozen in a moment. So it's like ripping up in the upper end, the highs, and the lows are kind of quiet, or vice versa. That's what we would call a power spectrum. That's what we have here. So we're taking, this is frequency on this axis here, so which corresponds to this, right? This is frequency, and this is just power. So like how intense is a particular frequency at a given time. So this is instantaneous, a single snapshot. So when you have a signal that has a lot of sympathetic modulation, where the person's ANS is sort of out of balance, or maybe they're being chased by a werewolf or something, and there's not a lot of parasympathetic input, it's going to look like this, where there's not a lot of high frequency changes in the heart rate, but there's a lot of low frequency changes in the heart rate. So the high power here, low power. Whereas a person who hopefully has a well-balanced autonomic nervous system with a lot of parasympathetic and sympathetic is going to have this kind of a power spectrum, where there's going to be a pretty big spike, a powerful spike in the high frequency oscillations, right? And that would be associated with rhythmograms you find down here. You guys following me so far? I know we haven't talked about yoga, but I'm getting there, I promise. Obviously, yoga affects this, and meditation. Okay, so just a moment to clear our brains, because I just put a pretty heavy bit of science on you there. We'll talk about this guy, Herbert Benson, for a moment. He was the first sort of Western scientist, the first sort of nerdy lab guy to get hip to meditation. And so prior to the 70s, meditation was really thought mystical. It's like vibrations. Let's all feel the vibe. The 60s, and before that, it was even, we've talked about a little bit of the history of it, right? Well, this guy said, look, there is an effect here. Let's quantify it scientifically. And how do we go about doing that? Well, he started by he was at Harvard, a neuroscientist at Harvard, and he took these meditators, some Tibetan Buddhist guy, and hooked them up to a bunch of electrodes and measured heart rate variability, breathing, and blood pressure, and sort of demystified this meditation. And so this is what I was actually hoping I would get to last time when I was talking about the relaxation response. This is the kind of meditation that we did last time. And it was this notion that you can control your bodily responses. Do you want to improve your heart rate variability? Do you want to lower your blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera? To an extent, you can affect this by eliciting what he called the relaxation response. So, and this is all that it involved. Go in a quiet, comfortable environment, close your eyes, relax your muscles, become aware of your breath. And then he liked to use some sort of mental device that was either like a chanting or fixing your gaze on an object like a candle or something like that. And we have already experienced this, haven't we? We did the meditation where we were chanting silently to ourselves, and then we did try to do it as a group, although I didn't probably pull that off as well as it could have happened. And it gives our mind something to focus on, right? It gives our mind an object to focus on. And then have this non-judgmental attitude. So like, oh, why can't I get my thoughts? Like, focus. Why am I not able to relax? Just like, let it be. So high heart rate variability, parasympathetic activation. He's the first guy to really say, oh, wow, there's something here. All right. So here's just some data. Here's some data from this woman in Taiwan, Dr. Xu. And what does she have here? So I told you there was the single measure of heart rate variability, which is the standard deviation that you can take across a whole data set. And that's what this SDNN is referring to in this data set. And she had a group of people that did yoga. I don't actually remember off the top of my head how long that was for, versus control group. And she saw their standard deviation go up. So that meant that there was higher heart rate variability after this study, whereas it actually declined a little bit. Control. And then she looked at the power spectrum. She looked at the low frequency and the high frequency regions. All right, low frequency corresponding to the sympathetic nervous system, and the high frequency corresponding to parasympathetic nervous. So parasympathetic, the power spectrum went up significantly in the test group, and sympathetic went down significantly. And all of these were also associated. So here, this is like the objective measures, and then here were the subjective or psychological measures. And she has, what are they called here? The Beck Depression Inventory, which I don't know. It's some sort of scale for that. But they went down. There was an improvement in the subjective sensation of depression by these patients, and it didn't change for the control. Whereas this other one, PSS, is Perceived Stress Scale. So this is like the thing I have you guys do, 1 to 5, right? That went down as well, whereas there was not significant change in the control group. Right? So there's a lot of studies out there like this. For the sake of time, I had another one that was kind of amazingly ridiculous to show you what a bad study looked like, but I cut it out. So, all right. Are there questions on this, on heart rate variability? Some of us are going to try to measure some of this today. All right. So I can pretend that it's for Jensen, but really it's not just for Jensen's interest. The nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system all go together. And the next series of slides, I'm going to try to tie all of them together into one sort of broadly connected picture of physiology. So I'm going to tie the immune system in, and you're going to see how important the immune system is to all of this. All right, so I say immune system, but there's actually two things. There's the lymphatic system and then the immune system. I'm going to talk about the lymphatic system first. And this is me jumping off the track just a bit that I've been on. But it seemed like the right place to put it, and I'll put it in there because it is important. So this last series, since Sarah got here, we have been talking about the brain and meditation and hormones and neural function. Before that, it was a lot of like the mechanical aspects of yoga, right, that we were discussing, like mechanical pressure on bones that increases bone density, or the stretching of the connective tissue that reduces collagen, or the blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of them. I'm going to return to that sort of mechanical aspects of yoga, and that's the story of the lymphatic system. So in general, what is the lymphatic and the immune system? Well, it's this part of the immune system that is responsible for keeping the house in order, for repairing things that are damaged, for fighting pathogens, making sure that cells that become cancerous get identified and killed and removed from the body. It recognizes self versus non-self. There are things that get in you that aren't supposed to be in there. Like you get a splinter, there's some bugs on it, kill that, right? Self versus non-self. And then it acts through various cells and signaling molecules. That's how it functions. There's a range of different cells in the immune system, which we're not going to really go into in detail. I can if you want after class. I have the slide. I just include it. And then, importantly, these signaling molecules, or cytokines, which are going to be a theme that I bang on a little bit here. Okay, so that's that. This is the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is basically a system of tubes and conduits in the body that carries lymph. This is where our white blood cells, the cells of the immune system, travel as they eliminate pathogens from our body. It is a parallel to, but outside of the circulatory system. And what are the parts of it? So the tonsils and adenoids are kind of specialized lymph nodes. Thymus, which sadly I won't get a chance to talk about at all, but it's this interesting organ that lives on top of the heart. That's particularly important in life. The spleen is a lymphatic organ. And then there's these lymph nodes, these little sort of berries in the chain of the lymphatic vessels themselves. And then your bone marrow is also considered to be part of the lymphatic and immune system. Yeah.
It's like in your tonsils and stuff. What happens when you hear?
Yeah, it's just the tonsils and adenoids are just another node in the chain, and you can function just fine without it. Okay. So lymphatic system is responsible for maintaining fluid balance and of course helps to protect you from infections and disease. So let's look at it a little bit. Here is a capillary bed, all right? So here's an arteriole, here's a venial. It's bringing fresh oxygenated blood into this capillary bed, into this tissue. And there's a bunch of cells in there, and there's fluid in between all the cells. That fluid comes out of the capillary bed and goes into the interstitial fluid, this tissue fluid, so that the cells can get nourished. And then it can return, some of it can return to these lymphatic capillaries, particularly if there is some white blood cell that has just like killed some pathogen or whatever and needs to head to the gut to unload it. It's gonna pass through these lymphatic vessels. And what do they actually look like, these lymphatic capillaries? Well, they're these little like pores that let into them, and they have like they're almost like valves that prevent the backflow of fluid. All right, they prevent the backflow of fluid. The lymphatic vessels are parallel to the vascular system, so that when the heart beats and that blood that's returning via the venous system is coming back to the heart, it's that like motion, that contraction of those vessels sort of is pushing that fluid along in the lymphatic vessels as well. But you'll notice, and this is where yoga comes in, you'll notice that the lymphatic vessels themselves are the lymph nodes are concentrated at major joint points, major areas of motion in the body. That's not a mistake. That's not a coincidence. So when you move a joint, you're kind of pressing and squeezing and stretching a lymph node. That's helping to push the lymph along. All right, that helps that lymph to move along that vascular tree. So when you're particularly sedentary, you don't get necessarily optimal flow of lymph through the body. So yoga, amongst other forms of physical activity, is beneficial in terms of helping to stimulate that. Yoga is particularly useful in that regard because it's controlled, supported, usually slow compressions of these joint points, right? So let's look at the history of this a little bit. Here is, I'm going to give you a case study where this is particularly evident. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with elephantiasis. Elephantiasis is a suite of diseases that are all characterized by blockages, parasitic blockages of the lymphatic vessels of your body. Yeah. I'm putting the nice ones. There are like Google image, man. I was melting my wife's brain at the table the other day. These are the nice ones. So here's an individual. This is this person's left leg. They got bit in the left leg by a mosquito. Which was carrying this parasite. There's a number of them, but this is Wucheria bancrofti is one of the types of worms. There's dozens of them that can cause a similar thing. They travel through the lymphatic system, and then they die. Your system kills them off, but then they block up your lymphatic vessels, and your body fills with lymph like that. It's a major mess. The dead worms clog up the limb or wherever that you got bit and leads to lymphedema. This is swelling of the tissue in the lymphatic vessels of that thing. Okay, so that's gross. Excellent question. The answer is yes. So there's medical treatment for the parasite, right? You can kill off the parasite, but then you still have to deal with the lymphedema, all these dead worms that are in your let's just call it what it is, Molly. Sorry. Got to get rid of that and get the fluid out of that tissue. And so in India, it's typically a tropical disease, and India is a tropical region. They've had this problem, right? And they use yoga very successfully down there to help treat the lymphedema. So here's an Indian patient with lymphedema in his legs there, performing some sort of yoga, so gomakasana, to help try to relieve the edema. There's this fig tree here, the Bengal fig. You can see the flowers on it there. They take the bark from the fig tree and they actually extract an oil from it that they rub into these limbs and to help in the manual drainage. So there's a lot of like rubbing and drainage that happens along with. So here are just some examples. Here's 201 days. It's not overnight. Yoga takes time. But this person, that's one heck of a leg right there. This looks bad, but that's actually a lot better than this. Can you imagine dragging that thing around? Likewise, look at this person. Woo-wee. Wow. And they were able to, after about a year and a half of doing yoga, able to significantly reduce the lymphedema that this person. Yeah.
Is there like yoga at least? Is there a way?
Yeah, we're talking about those lymphatic capillaries are teeny tiny. There's not really a surgical procedure that I know that you couldn't do that. I mean, you'd have to tear up this person's whole leg to get it. It's all through. Yeah, parasites. Be glad you live in Maine, man. And we do have ticks. We do have rickettsia, Lyme's disease. That's no fun.
Yes.
Oh yeah, a few. But that one, that's extra special. Okay. So the last topic I want to cover is actually the immune system. So that was a little detour into the lymphatic system. So in case you ever are confronted with elephantiasis, your knowledge of yoga will come in handy. It doesn't have to be just that, any kind of lymphedema. It's good for moving the lymphatic fluid through your body. So the way the immune system works is through a cellular response that is mediated by cytokines, chemicals. All right, these chemicals that cause cyto meaning cell, kine meaning kinetic or motion, they cause an action in cells. Cytokines are hormones that cause cells to do something. All right, and this should make sense because the cells of the white blood cells in the body, they're not rooted in one place, are they? It's not like some tissue that you can send a nerve right to and have it do its thing. They are distributed throughout the body. They can move around to where the problem is. So you want them responsive to chemicals which can reach them wherever they are. All right, does that make sense? There's a number of ways this happens. We can have cells that make cytokines so the cytokines are the red, that hit receptors on themselves and cause themselves to do things. All right? Okay, well, we'll see. I'll show you an example of when that happens. This is called autocrine. Auto meaning self. All right? Autocrine. Or they can affect nearby cells. Cells that are right next door, maybe not the same cell type, different cell type, target cell. This is called paracrine. It doesn't go through the circulatory system at all. It's just in that same tissue fluid that I talked about. And then lastly, cytokines can also go through the circulatory system and hit distant target cells. And we call that endocrine. Those are endocrine. That endocrine function. So these hormones are preparing the body, these cytokines prepare the body to deal with some kind of stress or damage or whatever, maybe infection, whatever it happens to be. And they do cross the blood-brain barrier. So this is important. They cross the blood-brain barrier and can change your mood. If you are stressed in some way, it will affect your mood. A lot of times people don't really separate those two things, but a stress is not a bad mood. Stress causes a bad mood, right? So these cytokines enter the brain, change mood, change behavior, and ratchet up the stress output of the brain. So we're going to see that in a moment. But I'm going to talk about the relationship between the brain and the immune system I'm not going through the like panoply of cells. I'm just showing you this because I'm going to use the macrophage. It's one type of white blood cell. I'm going to use that as the example. And so here's just a little picture of what a macrophage does. And I thought this was a good picture because it also showed some examples of how the cytokines in that last slide get used. So a macrophage, here's a picture of what they actually look like in blue. And the yellow is little bacteria. They put out these legs and they find the bad guys. It's like the amoeba that ate Philadelphia. They find one and they surround it and they kill it. So here's this macrophage. This is showing an infected cell, but it could also just be an individual bacteria. Whatever it is, this is something that needs to get taken care of. It gets surrounded and broken down. It gets broken down. Little bits of it come out on the surface of the cell. We call this antigen presentation. It sticks little bits of the pathogen, the non-self thing that has been identified, the bacteria, sticks it out here, and then these other types of white blood cells say, oh, whoa, there's something going on here. It recognizes these chunks of bits that get stuck out there as not being the self, and it causes them to start releasing these cytokines. All right, that can affect one another, that cause cell division, that start ramping up the immune the immune response. And so you have some more of these white blood cells. We call this one sort of tough-sounding cells, the killer T cell. Will release cytokines that have an effect on this totally different type of cell. This cell's been infected. The killer T cell puts out cytotoxic cytokines that cause this cell to just die. All right. So here are some just different ways that cytokines are being used in the immune system. Like this does not show it, but the macrophage itself can also put out cytokines. We're going to see that in the next slide. All right. So macrophages. This is the nitty-gritty details of this are not super important to me here, but I'm just showing that as an example of how the immune system works. This is where it's going to get. This is where it gets important. So here is. Let's imagine we get an infection. All right, we get an infection of some sort, or tissue damage. We get a splinter. Something happens, and the macrophage leaps into action. It sees the bacteria or whatever the problem is. There's some sort of problem, and it starts this process of inflammation. So when macrophages release cytokines, it's like them turning on a signal beacon in the tissue, right where they are, a chemical signal beacon that's going to initiate the whole immune response. There's going to be a chemoattractant aspect to that, meaning like histamine, for example, is a chemoattractant. It brings other cells to it. So a cell senses histamine and it travels up the histamine gradient. So here are a number of cytokines that macrophages. Tumor necrosis factor, IL-1, IL-6. Do you guys remember IL-6? Yeah. Okay. We've talked about that in connective tissue before as a pro-inflammatory cytokine. Cast your about that. So these cytokines that are getting released here in B, they can enter the brain through a number of different ways. They can stimulate sensory neurons that travel with the vagus, all right, cranial nerve 10, or they can just pass right through the blood-brain barrier. They can pass right through the blood-brain barrier. So they can either turn on the vagus or get right into the brain, and they're going to have effects in the brain. I'm going to walk through these. So once they're in the brain, they can get involved in a number of pathways that I got this slide it was talking particularly about how infection and chronic inflammation can lead to depression. That's not my point so much, but it is one consequence. So all these pathways, when they get lit up too much, lead to depression. So let's look at some of them. One of the pathways, one of the things that happens with these cytokines that get released by these immune cells are an altered metabolism of the happiness hormones, the happiness neurotransmitters. So serotonin and dopamine, right? Serotonin and dopamine are these neurohormones that, it could be said that the only thing that you really like in life is serotonin, if you want to talk about it like that. Like, so all these parts of the brain that that we've been talking about firing, doing this and that, they're likely using serotonin as that neurotransmitter that's being transmitted from one neuron to the next. So I don't know, maybe you know someone, maybe you have taken a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. That is a kind of drug that is used to treat depression and keeps serotonin in the synaptic cleft for longer. It inhibits the reuptake of serotonin. Anyways, these stressful cytokines here, they affect the production of serotonin. They suppress they change the metabolism of serotonin and dopamine. It's a real problem, like wide-ranging problem in the brain, certainly leading to depression. The next thing they do is they directly affect the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the top of the pyramid in the HPA axis, the stress axis. Oh, we're at overtime. Yeah, sorry, you just looked at the clock. Thanks, I was getting into. All right, well, we'll pick up with this slide next time. I only have about 10 more minutes of material that I want to give.